Hello. Health and safety in the workplace is a vitally important part of running and working in any business. Now, some people see it as inconvenient, over-bureaucratic, and an obstacle to getting the job done, but it really doesn't have to be like that. We have to keep in mind that sometimes accidents are just that, an accident, unpredictable and unforeseeable. But the whole point of health and safety is that we can all aim to avoid predictable and foreseeable risks in the workplace and do everything that is practicable, reasonable and possible to avoid accidents. The rules and regulations that we'll be discussing in this programme are not only effective, proven means of protecting your safety, but also strict legal requirements which, if applied effectively, will continue to ensure that the UK is the safest working environment in Europe. They could also save your life, and that's got to be worth paying attention to, hasn't it? In general, accidents in the workplace are caused by one of two things: unsafe acts or unsafe conditions. Unsafe acts are things like wearing the wrong personal protective equipment or bad manual handling techniques, something that you or someone else hasn't actually done correctly. Unsafe conditions may include slippery floors or litter, which can cause a trip hazard, general oversights, which are really everybody's responsibility to correct. Both unsafe acts and unsafe conditions are easily avoided through common sense and good housekeeping. If you see something unsafe or someone behaving or working in an unsafe way, make it your responsibility to do something about it. Now, this doesn't just mean clearing up spills or picking up litter, although of course these are very important. It really means checking that guards are fitted correctly before starting work, that people are fully trained on the equipment they're using, that sort of thing. It's all common sense, I know, but these things can be very easily overlooked. Never be afraid to challenge someone you think may be acting in an unsafe way, and always report anything untoward to a supervisor or a manager. Risk assessment is the key to health and safety. Risk assessment is, in many ways, the starting point for managing health and safety at work. And while it is primarily the responsibility of the employer to carry out the risk assessments, we can all contribute to the risk assessment process. First of all, we need to consider two things: what makes a hazard and what makes a risk. Now, it can be a little bit tricky at first, but basically a hazard is something that could cause an accident, and a risk is an estimate of the chances of that accident actually happening and how bad it would be if it actually did. Confused? Well, have a look at this example. A sharp filleting knife could cause harm, we can all agree on that, but it can only cause harm if it's actually being used. So the knife is the hazard, the chances of cutting yourself when using it, the risk. Now we have to consider the extent of the risk so we can decide if it's acceptable or not. If the knife is correctly stored on a rack, well, then there's little or no chance of it causing any harm. If the knife's being used correctly by someone trained to use it, who's wearing the correct personal protective equipment, then the risk is increased, but it's okay. If someone's running around the workplace waving the knife in the air, well, I think we can all say that that would not be acceptable. So, well, a bit of an extreme example, but you get the basic method of assessing risk. A potential risk in the frying arena is chips, which haven't been properly drained after soaking in dry white solution. The water residue left on the chips will heat up extremely quickly when the chips are actually put into the hot oil. Now, this causes the oil to boil up, and there is a real risk of the hot oil overflowing. Now, this also highlights the problem of having too much oil in the fryer in the first place. Once you start thinking about hazards and the potential likelihood and severity of the results, you quickly realise there are many factors which can multiply the size and the severity of the risk. And the fact is that many of these factors are entirely avoidable if we only use more common sense. So, now on to the risk assessment process. There are 5 basic steps. Step 1. Look at a particular task or activity and accurately identify all the hazards that may arise from it. Step 2. Identify anyone who might be affected by these hazards. This includes those people carrying out the tasks, anyone working near them, visitors, and so on. Step 3. What existing control measures are in place? For example, are there guards around dangerous machinery? Are people properly trained? Do they wear protective equipment? Step 4. Quantify the risk by working out the likelihood and the severity. You do this using a simple calculation which is explained in detail in your training pack. And step 5. Decide what further action is necessary to reduce the level of risk and prioritise this action. We'll talk about this in a bit more detail in a moment. The law states that if more than 5 persons are employed in the business, then all significant findings from a risk assessment must be recorded. It's always a good idea, though, to record all significant findings, whatever the size of the company. If anything does go wrong, then written records may prove useful. Risk assessments, needn't be long, overly detailed documents. They're usually little more than just a side or two of A4. Now, the more observant among you may have noticed that in step 3, we mentioned existing controls. What are these? Well, existing controls are the rules and practices which you already have in place, things like staff training and regular maintenance, which are adequate to deal with the risk you're assessing. Risks that are minor and tolerable usually require no further action if the existing controls are adequate. Risks that are moderate or substantial, even with controls in place, require you to take further action to reduce the level of risk. Now, in practice, this usually means something simple like additional protective equipment or maybe more extensive staff training. But every new hazard has to be assessed and dealt with on an individual basis. The best way to deal with a hazard is to eliminate it. But if this isn't possible, then the other options for reducing its risk potential are substitution or isolation, like substituting 240-volt lighting with 12-volt lighting around a wet fish counter, or maybe putting a guard around dangerous machinery to isolate the hazard from the employee. If you can't eliminate, substitute, or isolate a hazard, then maybe you can control it. Ventilation could be used to control dangerous fumes, and personal protective equipment can help you to control things like extreme temperatures. There's always a way of reducing the risk. The final control is discipline. Rules, regulations, signage, posters, and appeals to common sense are all forms of discipline. Personal protective equipment, or PPE as it's commonly called, has been designed and developed over many years to ensure the best possible protection from potential hazards without making the job impossible while wearing it. Now, we're all aware of things like goggles, earplugs and steel toe-capped boots and what they're effective against. But in the seafood industry, there is more specialised PPE which you really should be aware of. Chainmail or Kevlar gloves are extremely effective protection when using sharp knives. Rubber gloves protect against corrosive chemicals, and as there are extremes of temperatures associated with the job, particularly extreme cold, body warmers and other insulated clothing are often essential. Your employer has to provide all necessary PPE free of charge, and you have to wear it. It's not optional. In fact, it's a legal requirement. You should inform your supervisor if any of it is damaged, worn out, or in any way inadequate for its intended purpose. In a slight twist, the wearing of white coats, a hat and a hairnet aren't to protect you while at work, and nor are they a kind of traditional uniform. They're actually worn to protect the food from you during the manufacturing process. Now, there should be plenty of signage around the workplace to remind you what PPE you should be wearing in any given part of the workplace. So always be aware where you are, what you should be wearing, and why. Here's someone now in a work situation wearing the correct PPE. What does each piece protect them from? There's something called the Workplace, open brackets, Health, Safety and Welfare, close brackets, Regulations 1992. It's a government regulation, and basically it lays out in very clear terms your employer's responsibilities regarding your safety while at work. It covers things like the stability and suitability of the building you're working in, making sure it's maintained properly, that the workplace is adequately lit, well ventilated, all that sort of thing. Now, while your employer has a responsibility to make sure you're as safe as possible, you have to do your bit as well. Inform your supervisor of anything you see which is dirty or dangerous or out of place, or even if something just doesn't seem right. Vigilance is vital in maintaining the workplace. Also vital is good housekeeping. This is all about common sense and, well, tidying as you go. Store and stack things correctly and safely. Clean up or make safe and report spills or trip hazards. Keep walkways and traffic routes clear. Look for wear and tear on equipment or PPE. And if areas like the toilets, kitchen or hand washing facilities are dirty or in any way not up to scratch, tell someone. Just a quick mention of safety signs. They come in various shapes and various colours, and they work along similar lines as road signs. Now, there are far too many to go into detail in this short programme, but basically, red is for danger, yellow or amber means please take care, green is for safety, and blue means you must do. In terms of shape, circular with a red border means prohibition, for example, no smoking. Triangular is a warning, circular and blue denotes something is compulsory, and emergency signs are rectangular and green. There are also fire signs which warn of potential fire hazards and tell you where fire equipment can be stored. I know all of this can be quite a lot to take in, but all of the signs are very clear, and I'm quite sure you'll pick up the meaning of them all very quickly. Of course, the important thing is that you take notice of them whenever you see them. Here are some signs in situ. Identify them and outline what they mean. Almost everybody works with some sort of equipment every day, and virtually every piece of equipment has the capacity to harm you in some way. Now, the dangers of working with a knife or a cutting tool are obvious, but there are potential dangers even with seemingly innocuous things, like a cardboard box, for example. If it contains something heavy enough, it could crush your hand or your fingers. In your workplace, equipment hazards can broadly be separated into two groups: mechanical hazards and non-mechanical hazards. Mechanical hazards might include bandsaws or conveyor belts, something with dangerous moving parts. Think about the equipment you see every day. You're potentially exposed to crushing, shearing, cutting, entanglement, impact, stabbing, or puncture. It sounds grim, and, well, really it is. Mechanical equipment is extremely dangerous and completely unforgiving. If you do something wrong, the machine doesn't know it's hurting you, and it's not going to stop. The injuries you could sustain could seriously affect you for the rest of your life. So use your training, use your PPE, and most of all, use your common sense, and avoid putting yourself in harm's way. Non-mechanical hazards are a little less apparent and a little less dramatic, but they can be just as dangerous. Again, they come in many forms. Electric shock, for example, burning, excessive noise, low temperatures, vibration, and so on. All of these are all around you all the time, and all of them can cause you long-term harm. They often take a more subtle form than mechanical hazards, and so in some ways take a little bit more looking out for. Regulations designed to control work equipment hazards are in force in your workplace, and they must be practiced thoroughly. They're made up of four main areas. Firstly, all work equipment must be appropriate for the purpose that it's intended and the environment in which it's being used. Secondly, all equipment must be inspected and maintained. This is done regularly and to government standards. Next, training. Anyone who's to use the equipment has to be properly trained in its operation. And finally, safety measures have to be taken. This means that bandsaws must have guards on them, conveyor belts must have emergency stop signs, that sort of thing. Have a look at these pieces of work equipment and identify the nature of the hazard and quantify the risk it presents. What measures would you use to control the risks? To understand how to prevent fire, we first need to understand what causes it and how it spreads. We can explain this by using something called the fire triangle. For a fire to start, it needs three things: fuel, oxygen, and heat. A fuel can be, anything that burns, like wood or paper, petrol or butane gas. Oxygen is all around us in the air we breathe, and heat can come from many things like flames or sparks. These three things make up the fire triangle, and you only need to remove one of them for the fire to be extinguished. You remove the oxygen by smothering the flames. You remove the heat by cooling, and you remove the fuel by starving the fire. There are several ways of achieving this, and they're determined by the type of fire you're tackling. To help you decide, fires are divided into several categories. Category or Class A fires are mostly solid materials such as wood, paper, fabric and plastics. These are best extinguished with a water or foam extinguisher, although dry powder extinguishers can also be acceptable. Class B fires involve burning liquids such as petrol, oil and grease. You tackle these with a foam, CO2 or a dry powder extinguisher. Class C fires involve flammable gases like butane and propane, and the best extinguisher here is dry powder. Class D fires almost certainly won't affect your workplace because they involve burning metals like sodium and magnesium, and they require specialist fire extinguishers to deal with them. However, Class F fires will be of specific interest to anyone using cooking oils and fats. Fryer fires are an obvious and constant risk in fish shops and restaurants, and they must be tackled with a special wet chemical fire extinguisher. The chemical reacts with the fat or oil in the fryer and forms a crust which smothers the flames. Now, we should mention the risks from live electrical equipment and the dangers of electrocution. You must never use a water-based extinguisher on a fire involving electricity. Use a dry powder or CO2 extinguisher. Now, apart from fire extinguishers, you may also find fire blankets or hose reels. Hoses usually do the same job as water extinguishers and should be used on Class A flammable solid fires. Fire blankets, these should only be used on small solid material fires like clothing or an oil fire within something like a chip pan. They're totally unsuitable on larger fires. All staff should be trained in the use of fire extinguishers, emergency exits, and your firm's emergency response procedures, which covers things like the use of the fire alarm, muster point locations, and roll calls. The basic rule to remember in the event of fire is get out, get the fire brigade out, and stay out. Good luck, and more importantly, stay safe.